like to invite Alex O'Connor to lead the case for the proposition.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, do you want the good news or the bad news first? The bad news, is that God is dead. Of course, God is nothing more than an idea, but ideas can die as well, and if the most recent census is anything to go by, then if God is not dead, then he is at least in palliative care. The so-called rise of the nuns, by which I mean N-O-N-E-S, not some blockbuster Catholic fever dream, shows evidence of this in the fact that an increasing number, and now up to about 37%, of people in this country are not identifying with a religion at all. Christianity in this country, already a relatively lukewarm and dispassionate form of that religion, exemplified by the attendance of our nation's official church, which currently sits, I think, at a relatively pathetic 1.7% of the population, a church in which simultaneously trying to appeal to the woke left at the same time as the conservative Christians among us has managed to fall between two stools and rather spectacularly capture the imagination of neither. A church which still retains as the source of the majority of its relevance, limply clinging on to that equally moribund and self-defeating institution that is the monarchy, is not doing so well either. Monotheists, broadly, need not lose all hope, of course, because that same ONS did say that at least one form of religion is on the rise. I think a few, for example, Islam. So, for the opposition tonight, I suppose, some bittersweet information, the good news being that God may be alive or coming alive. The bad news is, it's the wrong God. Now, it may be that this general decline in religion is a mistake, perhaps due to an ignorance of the most latest scientific developments. It's commonplace to observe that the deity revealed by science throughout history is perhaps aptly described as the God that shrank, a sort of pantheon of natural phenomena previously attributed to divine agency has since been rid of their supernatural connection with an impressive consistency. Immanuel Kant once said that there will never be a Newton of the blade of grass. That graduate of the other place may have shown or may have discovered the laws that undergird the motions of planets. But there will never be someone who can come along and discover a similar key for biological complexity. Of course, in less than a century, Charles Darwin came along and did exactly that. We're now told that there will never be a Newton of the origin of life, or of consciousness, or of the fine-tuning of the universe. Maybe this is true. Maybe this time it really is different. I can't be certain, but what I can ask is what we think is more likely given our history and its trends. Now, if science doesn't guarantee God's existence, we're still told that it at the very least is indebted to men who believed in God. Since the entire scientific revolution was essentially a Judeo-Christian endeavour, and perhaps it's in the echoes of this influence that we can find the evidence that will negate the proposition that God is dead. I've always found this a strange observation. I would not claim that science has undermined religious belief, but if it had, then it would be no surprise to me that the people who invented the scientific method were not religious. Indeed, they must have been, because they hadn't yet invented the mechanism by which their beliefs would come to be undermined. It would be rather like saying, isn't it amazing that the man who invented the motor car previously didn't own a motor car? It's also worth saying that we'll never actually be able to know with certainty exactly what the religious views of these founding fathers of science were, fearful as they would have been, I suppose, to indicate even unorthodoxy, let alone skepticism about the very existence of God, and not out of simply, as it were, fear of God. Wherever it has had the power to do so, and whenever the threat of otherworldly hellfire has failed to rein in the pronouncements of heretics, clerical authorities have consistently provided, shall we say, a corporeal simulacrum, something of a practice run, preparing them for the infinite inferno to come, as they're set alight upon a stake and reduced to ashes in the full view of anybody else who may be tempted to similarly test the compassion of the church. But it's worse still. There is an increasingly popular argument, probably thanks to Tom Holland, the historian, that our entire Western morality, not just science, but the entire Western ethic, from its individualism to its social justice movements, is essentially downstream from that selfsame theological fountain. This as if the Western principles of individual rights, sexual freedom, religious freedom, freedom of speech and expression, equality of women, do not run completely anathema to everything that Scripture teaches and everything that its devotees have historically stood for. Modern society has determined, in other words, that religion might have been wrong about the position of women in society, wrong about the mortal fate of practicing homosexuals, wrong about the position of the earth in relation to the sun, wrong about the relative ages of both of those celestial bodies, wrong about the common evolutionary ancestry of all human beings and indeed all animals, wrong about the ownership as private property of other human beings. And in the face of this, religion does not come to us with apology and contrition for the things that it got wrong, but rather shamelessly attempts to annex these realizations as part of its own inevitable tradition. Yes, I know that St. Paul said, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to assert authority over a man, rather she should remain silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And that man is the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. But don't you know that the social justice movement is essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? Yes, I know that Galileo was shown the instruments of torture by the Inquisition for having the temerity to suggest that perhaps the earth might orbit the sun rather than the other way around. But don't you know that the scientific revolution is essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? Yes, I know that the Old Testament not only explicitly condones the ownership of other human beings as private property, but indeed gives detailed descriptions about exactly how to buy and steal them, sometimes as sexual property. But don't you know that the abolitionist movement is essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I find it funny, if it wasn't so insulting, to the history of the people who have secured these developments against the resistance of the very religious tradition that now wishes to claim them as its own.
Points of information?
I'm afraid I just don't have time. But see me after class. Perhaps the murder of God can be considered vengeance, I would say, for the murder by its most sycophantic servants throughout history of, to name a few, homosexuals, apostates, those belonging to the wrong religion, those belonging to the right religion, but so close, the wrong denomination, or the wrong interpretation. Oh, you think that the Son proceeds from the Father alone, and not the Father and the Holy Spirit? Well, you're about to find out for yourself as you meet your Maker. Now, suppose that society had taken an opposite turn. Suppose, in other words, that it embraced theocracy instead of democracy. It embraced laws punishing blasphemy instead of protecting religious expression. It continued to prosecute homosexuals instead of legalizing not only their private relationships, but now also their marriage. It continued, though perhaps condemning its more brutal manifestations, to allow human beings to legally and morally be called slaves. Could not the members of such a society just as easily and just as casually refer to the Judeo-Christian influence over their culture? Would they not indeed have a better claim to such a heritage than we do? Have you not read Leviticus, Exodus, Deuteronomy, and indeed the books of the New Testament, which, I'm sorry to say, can be counted alongside the Old in a list of books which can rightly be held responsible, in my view, for delaying the abolition of slavery even further than it already was by the moral cowardice of Enlightenment politicians and stage builders? If such a society has as legitimate a claim to this tradition, then I've just demonstrated the triviality of referring to this Judeo-Christian heritage in an attempt to keep God alive, as I think Tom Holland and others like him do, as it would be claimed by either of these opposite cases. If it is, as I think, much worse, that is to say, if such a society would actually have more of a claim to call itself Judeo-Christian, then I've demonstrated not only the falsity of the premise, but the truth of its reverse. Our society is not based on Judeo-Christian values. Instead, what we like to call Judeo-Christian values are whatever society has agreed is good. We simply lay our favourite ethic on top of the Bible to create a sort of theological palimpsest and hope that nobody remembers the injunctions which lie beneath it. And we do this in a desperate scramble to discover some legitimacy in clinging on to this mythical text and this mythical God, without which, after centuries of violent upheat, we are finally being forced to face the naked truth of our earthly and finite condition and find a way to, as it were, cull the living flower. So that's the bad news. The good news is that it may be a good thing that God is there, because we can, for the first time, observe life without him and notice what we're missing, and also cognize exactly what it is that killed him, and in rebuilding our collective life, ensure that such failures are not repeated. Society may well begin to discover a new route for its common humanity, as indeed it is beginning to realize that it must, after the promises of humanism and mere secularism, secularism have delivered nothing but an ideological vacuum that now feeds upon consumerism, self-gratification and radical politics. And for all I care, people can imagine a God to embody this rebuilding, as no doubt they will, in place, in other words, of our old dilapidated deity, maybe one directed of careful preservation of meaningful tradition and expulsion of outmoded ethical misfirings. In other words, the good news is this, that God may be dead, but as I'm consistently reminded, particularly by my Christian friends and colleagues, it's not unheard of entirely for gods to sometimes resurrect. Thank you very much.
I now invite the Right Reverend Dr. John Inge to start the case for the opposition.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great delight to be back in this debating chamber in which I spent very many hours here at Durham when I should have been studying, more hours than I care to remember. And I have a sort of sense of déjà vu because I debated a motion very similar to this for the Robson Cup, which I've seen sort of on a dusty shelf out there, in 1975. Yes, I'm that old, you wouldn't believe it, would you, to look at me. In 1975, I debated the motion, "This House believes in God." I was proposing that motion. And I'm delighted that this evening I have a much easier task, because I'm not asking you to believe in God, nor am I asking you to defend the indefensible, in other words, the actions of some of those who over the centuries have believed in God, to which the proposer of the motion has made a very copious reference. Of course believers have got it wrong. Of course the church has got it wrong. But that's not an argument for saying that God doesn't exist. It's just an argument for saying that Christians and other people of faith can be extraordinarily stupid and uncivilized. But the motion before us is "This House believes that God is dead." The proposer began by telling us the bad news that ideas can die, and he quoted the statistics for the latest census in this country. Well, it's true that adherence to faith in this country has decreased markedly over the last generation or two. But it's also true to say that faith elsewhere in the world has increased during that same period. In the millennium year, The Economist published an obituary of God. It was trumpeted, it was their main leader. The obituary of God. Only 7 years later, in 2007, they had to retract the obituary, saying that perhaps God was a little more alive than they imagined, when they published a book. The assistant editor and the North American editor published a book entitled "God is Back." Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the number of people believing in God over the world is huge and increasing. But I wouldn't want you to judge the argument over whether God is dead or not simply according to the intelligence or otherwise of the majority of people who adhere to him. Now, I want to suggest to you that in order to vote for this motion this evening, you would have to be an atheist. Because I'm not trying to pretend to you this evening that you have to have faith. I'm not trying to suggest that faith is absolutely essential. All I'm trying to say to you is I want you to admit that there is at least a possibility that God exists. Now, I admire atheists. I've watched some of the proposers' YouTubes, and I recommend them. They're great. Some really, really interesting and good stuff. But I admire atheists because atheism is a really, really demanding belief system. Most of us, including me, are agnostics. If you're a person of faith, you have to have doubts to go alongside it. Faith and doubt belong together. it's absurd to say that I have no doubt, because if you have no doubt, then it's knowledge you're given, not faith. Faith and doubt belong together. So yes, I have faith, but I also have doubt. So I'm somewhere along the spectrum of agnosticism. I'd like to think as a bishop I have a bit more faith than some, but nevertheless, I have doubts. Of course I have doubts. But if you're an atheist, you have to say, no, I unequivocally, absolutely, irrevocably assert that there is no God. The God is dead movement has a long and honourable history. Following the French Revolution, every self-respecting French and indeed continental intellectual believed that God was dead. But 200 years later, surprisingly, God is still very much alive. And the idea of God, despite what the proposer of motion said, is very much not dead. The fact that we are discussing the notion this evening means the idea is not dead. But what about the arguments for the existence of God? Well, there are lots, of course. Even the Christian scriptures attest, and we could have a long debate, the proposer and I, about what the scriptures say. The Christian scriptures attest to the fact that God is inscrutable, that God is unknowable. And St. Augustine went so far as to say, what then are we to say of God, brethren? What then are we to say of God? For if we have understood, we have understood something other than God. But what I want to suggest to you is that belief in God is a really sensible idea. And I expect the seconder for the proposition to oppose me, but one of the most significant things that's happened, I think, in the world of the philosophy of religion over the past generation is when the famous and philosopher Anthony Flew, who set the agenda for atheism for over 50 years, he came to believe in God. Not the Christian God, he didn't become an orthodox Christian believer, but having committed himself to follow the arguments wherever they led, determined after all that it's at least possible that there is a God. And he came to believe in a God. Now, as I say, you'd have to be an atheist to vote for this motion. And what I'd like to draw your attention to when asking you to think about this is consciousness, the whole business of consciousness. Let's perform a brief thought experiment. Think of the bench on which you're sitting, very uncomfortably. Sorry about that, and I hope it won't be for too long. Think of that bench. Do you think that given 1 billion or 1 trillion years or infinite time, that bench could suddenly or gradually develop consciousness or become aware of its surroundings and become aware of its identity? It's simply inconceivable, Anthony Flew suggests. Once you understand the nature of matter, of mass energy, I was a chemist in the past, so I'll try not to bore you with too much science, but once you understand the nature of matter, as Anthony Flew puts it, the origin of life cannot be explained if you start with matter alone. Or you might say, but what about AI? We can create machines that can think as we do. Of course, it's been in the news recently. But the point is that those machines are created by a life form that has consciousness, i.e. human beings. Furthermore, atheists propose that the universe is eternally existing, but they can't explain how this eternally existing state of affairs came to be. Theists, on the other hand, use the rationality of the universe around us, the way in which we are able to observe in nature extraordinary order and laws as evidence of a rationality behind and beneath. Why is it, think for yourselves, why is it that the universe is so ordered, is so incomprehensible? In other words, how do we explain such singular facts as our capacity to know and explicate truth? the correlation between the workings of nature and the abstract descriptions of these workings. How is it that Einstein was able to come up with his theory of relativity long before that relativity was proven? And I'd ask you furthermore to think about some of the most extraordinary things in the universe. I think we should be more in awe of mathematics. Now, some of you here might not think that mathematics is the most entertaining and wonderful and interesting of subjects, but it is extraordinary, as any mathematician will tell you, how order in maths is there to be discovered. Now, the God in whom Flew came to believe was a silent God, but a necessary God. One very similar, in fact, to that proclaimed by and proposed by Aristotle. Flew quotes the philosopher David Conway, and I'm going to conclude with this quote, or almost conclude with this quote. In sum, the being whom Aristotle considered to be the explanation of the world and its broad form, with its attributes, immutability, immateriality, omnipotence, corresponds very closely with the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's one that fully justifies us in viewing Aristotle as having had the same divine being in mind as the cause of the world that is the object of worship of these two religions. That's where I stand, in a long line stretching back to Plato and Aristotle and beyond. Having said which, if you wanted me to talk about the God in whom I believe, I wouldn't talk about any philosophical considerations. I tell you about a man who lived in the Middle East 2,000 years ago. But that's another story. Mr. President, I'm going to propose.
I now invite Dr. Andrea Rehberg to continue the case for the proposition.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a great honour. I hope you all enjoyed Alex's talk because it was very engaging, I thought, even though I'm on the same side. I'm here, though, as a representative of academic philosophy, so all of those of you who are students know what's coming. It's going to be a little bit dry right now. But I'm also here as the representative of the Friedrich Nietzsche Society. In fact, I believe that's why I was invited. So I will aim to convey what it is that Nietzsche meant when he said God is dead. Now, it is of course the case that, as the Honourable Opposition has already mentioned, that Nietzsche was not the first to say this, because Pascal, Hegel, and the German poet Heinrich Heine had already pronounced upon this. But I think it's true to say that Nietzsche's has been the most influential elaboration of this. So, who then is the God that Nietzsche says is dead? In one sense, it is, of course, the traditional God of Christianity in whom one may believe. But in another and more far-reaching sense, it is in fact the entire structure of reality. It is metaphysics in the broad sense of the term. And in that sense, God is a term for the way that supersensory ideals operate in order to produce a certain sense of reality for the human beings who live in it, in this reality. God is then merely a title for a certain ideal and a certain distribution of values that attend it. So this image of the world has, of course, been dominant ever since the time of Plato, who pronounced the supersensory world, the world of the ideas, a higher world, and in fact, even the only true or real world. And in contrast to that, this world, the world of mere appearances, was considered to be flawed, deficient, incomplete, and even unreal. Just think about that. The world that we live in is deficient, flawed, and unreal. And of course, we ourselves have come to think of ourselves in that way, as beings living in that world. Now, although this distribution of values between this world and the higher world is clearly life-denying, and hence, for Nietzsche, nihilistic, it was also the framework which gave meaning to life and provided a firm support for the spiritual and emotional lives of humans. Against this background, when Nietzsche proclaims the death of God, what he means ultimately is that the highest ideals which had organized our world for 2,500 years have begun to loosen their binding and organizing power. It is the end of security in God on which human beings had relied, and means that nothing is left to orient human being. As Nietzsche puts it in a very famous quote, it is as though this event, the death of God, has wiped away the entire horizon. Like the earth has been unchained from its sun, moving away from all fixed points, and as if it is plummeting into the black abyss, into an endless nothing, which makes everything feel colder. There is then a great pathos to this event, which we mustn't underestimate, the death of God, which, and this is important, is of course not a human doing, but a world historical event, with its own ineluctable necessity, as well as its own internal logic, namely what Nietzsche calls the self-overcoming, whereby all great things come to an end through such an act of self-overcoming. We, who inhabit the death of God, should think of ourselves as unmoored from any kind of certainty, as tumbling into an endless nothing, as he said. This is an indication of Nietzsche's understanding of nihilism, again, the absence of a comprehensive, binding force that designates to each their allocated place in the great hierarchy of being. Now, the term nihilism is clearly key here, and is deeply ambiguous, and more often than not misused. We have just seen what Nietzsche means by it, namely a historical development and not anyone's private beliefs or opinions. But nihilism has different meanings. I said earlier that the metaphysics or two-world theory that dominated the Western world and its tentacles for millennia is itself nihilistic, insofar as it deprives this world of all meaning and value and arrogates it to the other higher world, and hence denies the value of finite life on earth. But the event of the death of God is also nihilistic in another sense, namely as the absence of all meaning from life, and specifically as the absence of transcendence. In fact, we might formulate the difference between the two kinds of nihilism as follows. In the era of metaphysics, there was too much transcendence, locked in the figure of the monotheistic God, and it was this surfeit of transcendence that was crushing life on this planet. Whereas with the event of the death of God, there is not enough transcendence. And this lack of transcendence also leaves us bereft of meaning. But, and this is the crucial point, this second kind of nihilism, the one we're experiencing now, does at least represent an opportunity, and Alex has already referred to that, an opening, namely to become creators of values ourselves, and hence to forge a transcendence rooted in the body, in this world, a transcendence rooted in the immanence we are, no longer dependent on a pre-given meaning and an existing transcendence or a given transcendence, but able to forge a new world of value, meaning, and beauty, and to affirm the life we are. But that endeavor too is fraught with danger, insofar as we might put up another God, and this is probably the most controversial part, which we have arguably already done by putting human being, or man, in the place of God, and so instigate a new metaphysics, this time around man, Arguably, this is what has been happening since the Renaissance, since the Enlightenment, and this has given rise to the ideal of a thoroughgoing humanism, such that human life is considered. No, sorry. Soon. Sorry, such that human life is considered theoretically, ideally sacrosanct, even as many millions are in practice perpetually being sacrificed to the capitalist order which spans the entire planet nowadays, or to the many wars raging around the world. This as a reminder that what has thereby happened is that man, as an ideal, might have replaced God, but the essential theological structure of metaphysics has remained unaltered. God might be dead, but he's being resurrected continuously in the form of man. By contrast, if we genuinely want to affirm the death of God, and I assume some of us do, we must smash all idols, and not just the image of the one monotheistic transcendent God, the God of Christianity. Nietzsche calls it incomplete nihilism when one attempts to escape nihilism without transvaluating the former values. One is merely substituting new ones. Thus, what is needed is what is needed is a thorough transvaluation of all our former values. This should lead to a complete nihilism, which indicates a true liberation and affirmation of human beings' own perpetual self-overcoming, as well as a proliferation of the perspectives which guarantees that no one view or perspective can any longer dominate the entire world and society. As Nietzsche says, God is dead. God remains dead. But the only question for us is how we inhabit this event. Thank you very much.
I now invite Professor Simon Oliver to continue the case for the opposition.
A few years ago, my then 6-year-old son was lurking at the back of church after the morning service, and one of the members of the congregation came to him and said, "Ben, what does Daddy do for work?" And he looked at her and sighed and said, "He goes to the university to talk to people about theology." And she said to him, "Ben, what's theology?" And he looked at her and said, "Nobody knows." I hope to convince you that there's a little bit more to it than that. The secretary has already given us a very erudite account of Nietzsche and the death of God. And that's where I'd like to pick up now, to do a little bit of cultural scene setting for our question in order to oppose the motion that God is dead. 1882, Nietzsche publishes The Gay Science, and in book 3 we read the famous parable of the madman. In the bright morning light, he lights a lamp and runs around the marketplace crying incessantly, "I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God. God is dead, and we have killed him. But how did we do this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away an entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained the earth from the sun?" Atheism today, in our own time, tends to be very triumphalist. We roll back the childish, obviously absurd myths of religion that belonged to a superstitious and credulous past, the fairy tales that happened to be the building of Durham Cathedral. And we breathe the cool, clean air of modern freedom, rationalism, and science. But for Nietzsche, the death of God, as the seconder said, was a catastrophe. Unlike Richard Dawkins, he understands that belief in God is not just one more belief amongst others. We can't just unscrew it, discard it, and carry on as if nothing had happened. Belief in God was the entire moral and social framework of Europe. Later in The Gay Science, Nietzsche writes, even less may one suppose many to know at all what this event, the death of God, really means. And now that this faith has been undermined, how much must collapse because it was built on this faith, leaned on it, had grown into it. For example, our entire European morality. Everything needed to be reconstructed against the background, as the second has said, of this utterly dark nihilism. Maybe Nietzsche was right. Maybe God is dead. At the very least, it seems that God is forgotten. The culture of Western secularized Europe, overtaken by a general materialistic and mechanistic view of the world, at least in the popular imagination, cannot think God, or at least it's deeply uninterested. But the God this culture has forgotten or killed is not actually the God of traditional Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. It is a God of 18th century fabrication, a God who engineers the universe as I might engineer a car, a God who tinkers here and there, arbitrarily rewards some and not others, is a kind of very big thing alongside the universe we inhabit. That God, the God most atheists are quick to dismiss, is dead. But Nietzsche recognized that the death of God, or at least the realization of its consequences, would be a very slow process, and that may not yet be complete. We are still haunted, I think, by the sense that although our modern philosophical and scientific worldview works because we can control and manipulate nature, it is inadequate in dealing with the basic intuition that experience is purposeful, agential, value-laden, beautiful, precious, fragile, that life is to be nurtured, treasured, that we might even be a gift to one another because we are a gift to ourselves. These are profoundly human intuitions, the things that matter most to us. This comes from a sense of the mystery of our own being and consciousness whenever we're not consuming the opiates of modern capitalism. Maybe a naturalistic worldview, a worldview that sees no intrinsic meaning to existence beyond the meaning we give it, or the meaning given to it by the most powerful, may be such a worldview that often reduces love and longing and grieving and moral outrage and suffering, beauty, goodness, to nothing but blind material processes. Maybe that conclusion is just a bit premature. Maybe it represents a failure of imagination. Maybe, like mad people, we should continue looking for God because we are, at least some of us, sometimes, astonished that there is something rather than nothing. We regard that as a legitimate question, and we refuse to stop with the conclusion that the universe is just a brute fact. Given Nietzsche's prophecies 140 years ago, it's surprising that the question of God is still interesting enough to bring you here tonight. But there are some serious impediments and good reasons to think that God is in his grave and must remain there. The most compelling, of course, and I really do want to address this, is the so-called problem of evil. Let me say now that attempts to justify God in the face of evil and suffering, sometimes known as theodicies, they all fail because they turn evil and suffering into something good for us. Evil is good for soul-making, the demonstration of exemplary virtue. Evil is worth it because of free will, etc., etc., etc. They fail to take evil seriously. A few years ago, I worked as chaplain to a children's hospice, in fact the world's first children's hospice. Nothing, I learned, nothing can justify the death of a child from cancer. But atheists often present the problem of evil and suffering as if it had never occurred to believers. But reflection on evil is right at the heart of the Christian tradition, right from the beginning, and the Jewish tradition before it. But it's at the heart of it in a very particular way. Before it asks about the experience of suffering, or the origin of evil. It asks, what is evil? What is the experience of evil and experience of? A very traditional answer to that question is that it is an experience of the absence or lack of the good. Something is not as it should be. The good is what is intelligible to us. We can give reasons for it. To say she is a good friend is to say she is what a friend ought to be. Evil is that which is unintelligible. It doesn't make sense, and we rightly scream, why? But our very ability to recognise evil as evil depends on a prior and fundamental orientation to goodness. Brokenness is a good analogy here. Brokenness is not something in itself, apart from something that is broken. Evil is not something apart from the absence of the good or what ought to be. Evil is what happens to good things. Evil carries with it a sense of brokenness. So our very ability to recognise evil as a problem relies on two ontological claims about what things are. First, that the universe is fundamentally ordered to the good, which is the fundamental teaching of the book of Genesis. It is not indifferent nor value-free, and its intelligibility, including its scientific intelligibility, is dependent on that goodness. Secondly, our ability to recognise evil as a problem at all is dependent upon our prior orientation to goodness and a deep intuition concerning the way things ought to be. Thirdly, our recognition of what evil is a prompt to action based on a set of commitments concerning how the world ought to be. Now, there's a long way to go from those claims to God, a very long way indeed. But I do want to say that this way of looking at evil is the background for understanding something very, very important, namely how religious people in reality deal with evil and the suffering that it causes. What do they actually do? How does their form of life, rather than a set of arguments in a philosophy book, form a witness to the ultimate victory of the intelligibility of the good, or what we call God, and God's eternal and redeeming love? Thank you very much.
I now invite Jerry Lee to finish the case for the opposition.
Good evening, my lord, ladies and gentlemen of the Durham Union. To begin with, one has to marvel at the specific quality of the English language. You see, if you say the notion in Latin, you would say, "Primus Deum mortem esse," we believe God to have died. That, I think, is a theory that unifies both sides of the house. Christ has died, said the Book of Common Prayer, and us mortals did in fact kill him. God, as man, as it were, has died. But constricted as I am to the language of Shakespeare, I shall not be facetious. I stand here, not to proselytize, as I'm often accused of doing in this place, not to list the many merits of religion, not even to convince you that God exists. I stand here to refute the silly claim that God, be he real or imagined, had once been and is now dead. On the 15th of April 2019, Notre Dame of Paris is burned. Beams tracing the time of St. Louis returned to dust. Exquisite stained glass windows were shattered. The spires that looked over Joan of Arc's procession, St. Bartholomew's massacre, and the guillotines of the Revolution, the march of Napoleon's and Hitler's eagles crumbled down. Sometimes we might feel as a fireman feels, treading through what is left of our Christian heritage. All around him, beauty that may at any time collapse, charred remains of sacred objects. Merry tingles of what once had been, and now seems so hollow, irretrievably fragile and lifeless. Yet the cross, somehow, still gleams somewhere. It is not untainted by dust. It is perhaps not altogether upright. One sees, your eyes tearful in the smoke, a golden cross on the altar of ash. According to tradition, this country is a godly country. For centuries, saints and gargoyles alike peered down from many great religious monuments such as this one. But does it feel like now we pay regards to a dead god as a half-hearted formality? The coronation, of course, was quite splendid. But did we really care very much at all about the anointment's divine significance? Sitting quietly on the pews of a neglected parish church, the pomp all seems a bit like a shroud of continuity, a splendid museum piece. We celebrate Christmas and have cross buns on Easter Sunday. Do we not sing carols only because we enjoy belting them out at school? In fact, one is apt to recall Chesterton's words. I tell you, not for your comfort, nor for your desire, save that the sky grows darker yet, and the sea rises higher. But do forgive me if I sound like a funereal eulogist. Unlike Nietzsche, I'm not here to lament. But why am I so confident? Is it because of some irrational zeal? Am I myself a relic waiting to be swept away by the tides of modernity? Not so. Not any like Like the shining cross on the ashes of 1,000 years, I contend that God will never die, whilst the vision of God still lives. In a few millennia, when the traces of this civilization, even you and I, have vanished, a man may yet uncover some long-forgotten text, read it, and be drawn to this amazing promise of God. Many theologians may summarize God better than I. The vision of God, for me, offers in place of cosmic skepticism, joy, in place of despair, hope, and in place of danger, love. Suffice it to say that belief in a just and loving God offers an explanation and a solution to the human condition. Inadequate, I'm sure, for some. Even the most obstinate atheist would acknowledge that God is at least a tempting and enduring fiction. It had captivated great minds and inspired countless works of the highest intellect. Nietzsche, of course, claimed that this God vision is replaceable in the modern society. Like a cracked machine that would eventually be obsolete and part by part entirely replaced. This vision, the proposition I have to contend, is entirely obsolete in modern day. Whilst the more cynical among you might consign all this to misguided illusion, whether it be truth or delusion, the thought of God persists dauntless. But no matter what material comforts the modern world may furnish us, they could only delay and cushion the fundamentals of life's vicissitudes. We push back illness, we cannot extinguish death. We purge want and poverty, but could not reach perfect justice. We set up idols and ideologies, but they would not serve at all. We still cannot avoid staring into the abyss and pondering. We still desire to know what is truly good beyond spreadsheets and cost-benefit analyses. And we may not yet all turn to God for these queries. For so long as these queries are not adequately answered, so long as doubt persists over something more than sensuality or the raw thrust of power, God still shall be among us, and few have it deserted. Today, as his lordship said, there are more believers of God than in any other previous age. Nevertheless, in many countries such as this, the lamp perhaps is sometimes dim at the altar. Yet have we not seen this before? When the first Christians were in their rags and in their drawers being herded into the Colosseum, the onlookers too said they were misguided, deluded, subversive. In the French Revolution, the priests were enemies of this seemingly unstoppable march of reason and progress. The revolutionaries tried in vain to wash out God with bloodshed. Under the totalitarians of the 20th century, arguably the vision of Nietzsche's own Leutner, tens and thousands of the faithful were submitted to firing squads or gulags in quest of this godless utopia. But under the Nazi yoke, Father Herbert's martyrdom offers a glimpse into this amazing vision of God. His act of self-sacrifice into the gas chamber for a total stranger's sake is a pure and selfless act, inexplicable except with reference to faith in God. Here is a certainty. That was not nothing. More recently, we hear similarly harrowing tales from the Libyan desert. 20 Christians were beheaded by ISIS for refusing to give up their faith. The spirit of the Colosseum and of Gobet is still alive in the world today. For the persecuted, the idea of God is the ultimate freedom and refuge no tormentor can ever deprive them of. And this freedom and this justice will always be alluring on its own terms. There is always a shaft of light in the blackest of despair. The hope of God's justice has always been that light. There is, in fact, a meaning. If you think this idea of God is irrational, I see where you're coming from. If you say this idea is wrong and harmful, I disagree. But if you are to declare this idea dead, where to this day so many risk so much in its pursuits, when the idea continues to enthuse and confound in literature and philosophy and many other fields, when the worship of God has ebbed and flowed and survived the unsleeping efforts of princes, gauleiters, and commissars to distinguish it, to declare that this idea lacks vitality, the proposition would, I think, be finding themselves on the more deluded side of the house. Indeed, God's image may yet be removed from Westminster Abbey. Cathedrals like this may yet return to rubble like the first or the second temple. The Church of England, God forbid, may yet be established. But even if we grant Nietzsche's prophecy, let that immense frightful shadow retreat, and let modern European morality collapse, that will only return the state of God's promise to the very beginning, when lonely apostles preached the hostile world, and the likeness of God presided over ragged catacombs. None of this necessarily supposes that God must be real, but what has more life than the alluring, undying possibility? If you are at least touched by this possibility, you will probably vote for the opposition. I shall conclude in the words of Kipling. The tumult and the shouting dies, the captains and the kings depart. Still stands thy nation's sacrifice, an humble and a contrite heart. Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget.
I'd like to thank all of our guests for their fine speeches, and now I'd like to open up the floor. So if you would like to give a speech of 2 minutes in length on either the proposition or the opposition for the chance to win the book that Maria talked about earlier, then please stand up, raise your hand, and when picked, say your name and college. Are there any people willing to speak, give a floor speech?
Anastasios Alexakis, you can just call me Stats. Woo! Rebellion College. God will die the day we stop talking about him. Until then, he is alive and well. The fact that we are gathered here tonight for this debate is proof that God continues to be as relevant as he ever was in history. People will say that our generation signals the nail in the coffin for God, but I want to challenge such a notion by saying that God has pulled many nails out of the coffin before, and some even out of his own hands. Think, for example, of the Jews prior to the coming of Christ. How God preserved them for hundreds of years through slavery and oppression, and how he kept to his promise of delivering them from their enemies. By so doing, God not only kept the Jews alive, but also the God they believed in. Some of those Jews would go on to accept Christ as the Son of that God which they believed in, and become Christians. As Christians, they would suffer persecution and death under the Romans. Yet again, God would deliver his people from their enemies, this time giving them dominion over the very Rome which had tried to kill them, and the God which they worshipped. This is where it gets a bit controversial. But this Rome, which God had given to his people in order to preserve the faith, became a distorter of the faith by replacing Christ with the Pope. And so, once again, God delivered his people from the enemy by creating the East-West Schism in 1054, and thus preserving the faith in the East. However, disaster would also strike in the East in 1453, when the Ottomans conquered Constantinople. So God preserved his faith with the Russians until the time was right. The right time came in the year 1821, when God launched the Greek Revolution and liberated his faith from the Ottomans. God had done it again. Just as he had liberated the Jews, just as he had liberated the Christians, just as he had liberated the Byzantines, he had also liberated the Greeks. Since the year 1821, God has been delivering the faith through the Greeks across the world. Now, that is a very specific retelling of the story of God's people. And you might hear it told slightly differently by the Catholics. But the central point remains. When God is pronounced dead, he raises his people up. That reminds me of someone who was nailed to a cross and rose again after 3 days. Thank you very much.
Okay, do we have any speakers for the proposition? Yes.
I think the strength of the proposition's arguments should be enough to convince you to vote for the motion tonight. But I do recognise that if you are Christian, why should you vote for the proposition? If you believe in your heart that God is alive, why vote for the proposition? Well, I want to give you 2 reasons. The first is in line with orthodoxy. Sorry, lowercase o. But the first is in line with orthodoxy. And the reality, and it's an argument from reality. The reality is, at least in British society, God is dead. God fails to play a significant force in society. Even a census which shows that 40-odd% of people in this country are Christians, we all know those Anglicans who, they tick the box because their grandma's mother's aunt was baptised twice. And so it's not entirely convincing. And actually, this should be seen as an opportunity for the Christian community. They need to admit the jeopardizing situation that they are in order to rise and meet that challenge. They need to see the reality is that God is dead in order to launch a crusade, forget the connotations, to revive God, to resuscitate God. So that's an argument for reality. But the second one is something more controversial. But for those open-minded Christians, I'd like you to hear it. God is dead, literally dead, and he has literally killed himself. And I think this is at the core of the Christian message. What makes Christianity so distinctive is the relationship between God and man. Unlike other religions like Islam, the religion of submission, where the highest relationship you can have is that between God and man is slave and master. In the Christian world, it's friend. God trusts man. And in the light of this distinction, how do we interpret the crucifixion? In the light of that, I think the only way you can interpret crucifixion is God killing himself. Truly, at the moment of the crucifixion, God gives all moral authority to us. No longer can we do good actions just because, God says so, or for a heavenly reward. Truly, God gives creation to us in a moment of beauty, in a moment of true benevolence. God kills himself and he gives creation to us. So, if you're an Orthodox Christian and you really think that secularism is a challenge, then please vote with the proposition tonight and say that God is dead. But also, if you think that in all his benevolence, God has given creation to us and given moral authority to us and fulfilled his relationship, please trust that God has killed himself and that God is dead.
for the opposition. Yes, in the corner there, yes. Yes, if that's... yes, name it called.
Carmody Gray, no college yet. There seems to have been a remarkable amount of equivocation in the case of the opposition. Let's just be clear, there are three senses in which one might say that God is dead. And I would suggest to you that in all three cases, we can't say that God is dead. Number one would be, roughly speaking, sociologically. That is to say, we would have to be able to say that people in general are no longer believing in God. At the global scale, that is so untrue that sociologists are thinking that the secularization thesis is dead. People are not believing in God less at the global level, and they're not becoming less religious at the global level. So at the level of society, God is not dying, and to think so is an extraordinary an extraordinary myopia based on our tiny little bit of the world where we live, which is increasingly irrelevant. So, the second sense in which we might think that God is dead would be, say, objectively, in the sense in which we might think that anything is or isn't there. And to that point, the sociological question is totally irrelevant. It might be that absolutely nobody recognises the law of gravity, but it's still there. On that point, there is simply no successful rational proof in either direction, and the state of philosophy of religion demonstrates that abundantly. There is no settled case that either is or isn't a God that has satisfied everybody, and therefore the question, to repeat the point of the Honourable Speaker, the first Honourable Speaker for the opposition, the question must be left open. And atheism in that sense represents a quite extraordinary degree of intellectual confidence in something that is unknowable. So sociologically, God is not dead. Objectively, God certainly cannot be said to be dead. The third sense in which you might think that God is dead would be existential. That is to say that it's possible to live successfully and meaningfully without God. Without wanting to get into detail, the God that is relevant here, to pick up on the point of the second speaker for the opposition, is the God who is something like a source of transcendent order and meaning by which people live, by which people are oriented. In that sense, the meaning of the word God is really universal and has nothing to do with teachings of some particular religion versus any other that is universal. I would suggest, looking at human history and at the present, this God is necessary. It is actually necessary that people have a sense of orientation to some moral, aesthetic, spiritual reality beyond themselves, or they cannot live. This is the point that the second speaker for the opposition made very eloquently. If we deny that there is any ground of order or meaning beyond the human mind, we really do socially, morally, politically, personally collapse. So in all three senses, God cannot be said to be dead.
And do we have a floor speech for the proposition?
Yes.
Dan Robson, Johnson College. So I'm going to address complexity arguments. I've had it said that don't understand how life might have come about. So there are intermediate steps. Essentially, in hydrothermal vents, you get repeated chemical cycles that eventually cause RNA and stuff like that.
So fundamentally, why, on a much larger level, why is there something rather than nothing? The religious or the theistic belief is God started something, so God therefore must have existed before the universe, so calling him an extra-temporal entity, right? So he must have existed in his entirety when there was nothing. So if you imagine the number of things that could have existed when there were nothing, right? So you've got essentially something from outside that I think of it as a zero-dimensional space, right? Wherever you are, you can have an infinite number of them, okay? And so essentially, you've got these things that generate a large set of rules, and one of them, i.e. God, must be infinitely complex if you allow free will. So you have things that work much like biology, simpler systems that create, that either don't work or do, and if they don't work, they collapse, and if they do, they can create something like what you do around you, potentially. That, I suppose, answers my view as to why there is something rather than nothing. So inherently, the argument that everything around you is so brilliant because there is something is cyclical, because you're saying God made it, and you're using that as evidence of God's existence, yes.
Your argument is based on God as a material thing.
Yes.
How would you account for your own sense of purpose in life?
I don't believe in objective morality. I believe I'm a biological organism, and by essentially a process of cultural evolution, we've agreed on a set of rules that have, created society as it is, give us some roles, give us potential to explore those roles, change our ideas, and I as an individual and we as a society, love them through. That's my view. Thank you.
All right, we'll now move on to questions to either side. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. And remember to state your name and college for the minutes. Also, we'll write you an invitation if you've given a floor speech or if you ask a question to come to our drinks reception at 24's just down the road afterwards. So make sure to come and pick up your invitation. Are there any questions? We'll go ahead.
So this one is actually for the proposition. I'm just stating in your best case scenario where God is a figment of the common imagination of the public. How can you still say that God is dead when people every day say, "Oh my God," when we hear carols every Christmas that are "God rest you merry gentlemen"? It's like saying Santa Claus is dead. Some people say that Santa Claus is not real. They don't believe in Santa Claus. So obviously, it's their own right to do so, as their right to not believe in God. But still, the concept in and of itself exists. It's plastered on every single supermarket wall come December. The same with God. It's stated almost every day. "Oh my God, oh my goodness." Something of the sort is stated every single day. How can that concept in and of itself be dead?
If I may, if you were to sneeze, I might say "bless you," despite the noise isn't anymore at play. I'm afraid to say I think it's as simple as that. That is to say, why we say, "Oh my God," clearly, we do have some kind of linguistic heritage. The English language has a lot to do with the Bible, for example. It's indebted to Scripture, to many of its words and terms of phrases, but the actual content that inspired them, in the same way that the content that inspired the tradition of saying "bless you" after something needs to disappear, this strange custom remains, but I think it's essentially empty.
Yes, but the concept of a plague is still very much alive. We know that a plague existed. That's not.
slides, I'm sorry. Are there any more questions? We'll go there at the back, yeah, in the green.
I think this is for the proposition, but more so.
Can you state your name and proposition? Stand up, please, so we can hear at the front.
Do I have to stand as well?
Yes, please. Sorry.
Jack Hatfield College. I think this is more proposition in that if we do accept the idea that in some way God is alive, in that he's still within the zeitgeist of or within the conversation as a whole, would we not rather ask or say that God is killable in the sense that as history progresses, as man progresses history, there are attempts to completely rid society of God, as we've seen in socialist projects such as the Soviet Union, where the attempt is made to remove God. Could this not be a possibility? Could we not succeed in doing this next time? Could there not be, when the global socialist revolution takes place, the complete removal of God?
We've heard, I think, twice now, reference to the death of God essentially by force. And I think that can happen. I don't think that it should. I think what Nietzsche is talking about is a death of God as an idea, as a sort of natural result of human beings reflecting on the state of affairs. Of course, yeah, we could march in with our guns and force people to convert or reduce them to corpses if they refuse, and that would kill God by killing his believers. But I don't think that would be an appropriate thing to do. Is it possible?
I think that's a slight misinterpretation of what I'm trying to ask. I'm asking
if I did misinterpret it, then I don't want to be unfair. If I'd asked a question that wasn't asked.
I don't want to push with another question, but I'm saying that in the event of socialism, which doesn't seek to eradicate religion through killing, but rather through it's no longer necessary, as Marx described, it's an opiate for people, it's only used as an escape from capitalist reality. Could this not be the case that God is killed in that form?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, if that were possible, I think that would obviously be in support of our case, right? That God is, if not dead, then on his way to being so. And so I think that would be in our favour, and perhaps something that really puts the opposition instead, maybe.
And the opposition like to comment anything on Are there any questions for the opposition? We'll go here.
Woody, Trevelyan College. I think a lot of your arguments were based on the existence of God, whereas I want to know how you would respond to Alex's argument that God is no longer useful, relevant, or good for our society.
Thanks, Woody. I do think it's true that the biggest problem facing the church is not atheism. It's actually quite difficult to find a hardcore card-carrying atheist these days. Alex is a pretty good example. There are not many of them around. The real problem is indifference. The real problem is people just don't ask the question. And that's why I was talking about God not so much as dead, but as forgotten. And an inability to think cogently about what the word God means. You know, a real kind of religious theological illiteracy. And how the church addresses that is a significant issue. So I think if you're going to make the case that God is dead, then that's the case you've got to make. But the problem is, as several speakers have pointed out, globally, this just isn't the case. You know, the idea that God is irrelevant is a highly Eurocentric idea. And you know, you've got to take seriously and not patronise religious believers around the world. You know, atheists do represent, I think, statistically, it's very difficult to measure, but something around 10% of the world's population. Right now, you know, so a minority for sure. But to say that the idea of God is irrelevant, I think, at that level is simply not true. But also, I think, you know, as one of the speakers put it, we've been skating around the issue of moral realism. Are there actually objective moral values? One or two people have suggested that there aren't. We just make them up, or they're subjective or emotivist. Now, I think that approach to morality is profoundly dangerous, because the morality that will prevail is the one of the strongest. It's a will to power, and it leads to very, very severe political consequences. Now, I think insofar as we still believe in moral realism, I think the question of God, of transcendence, of something beyond us, that draws us and forms us, that is a given, still remains highly relevant to the way that people morally negotiate the world every day of their lives. As simple as that. So yes, the God issue in that general sense is very much there front and centre, just when you try and live your life, because without it your life is not livable.
Are there any more questions for either side? We'll go here.
Alexander from Rehberg College. Do you think religion in this country is a salvageable affair?
I'll turn around so I haven't got my back to you. The answer to that question is yes. And I say that simply because I believe in God. I didn't try to persuade you to become believers. I simply tried to persuade you that the idea that God is not dead, that God exists, is at least possible. But I am a believer, and I believe in a God of history who acts. And one or two other people have put very eloquently the case for the way in which resurrection is possible from death, and new life is possible even in the sense, in the face of what seem like insurmountable odds.
Would the proposition like to add anything? You don't have to. That's right. Okay. Any more questions? Okay, Mohab.
Yeah. So the question for the opposition is, would you think that the unreasonability of God is a good enough reason not to believe in God, in the sense that humans aren't the absolutely rational creatures that you make them to be, in the sense that reason is inert and we're mainly driven by passion, and so we're driven by mystery, by passion, etc. And so God is almost like a manifestation of our irrationality as humans. So it doesn't really matter whether God exists or not, in order to pretend at least to believe in God. So isn't God more of a passion or a manifestation of our passion, and us being an irrational creature rather than just an idea? Like an idea is much more reduced than that. Thank you.
Was that to the proposition or the opposition first?
Whoever.
Whoever. Okay. Well, we can go to the proposition.
Do you think the unreasonability of God as like an idea of the puzzle is enough to not believe?
Well, I can't really speak to that because I wasn't talking about belief. I think that's a different issue altogether. I was simply trying to convey the situation we're actually in, whether we recognise it or not. So, you know.
The opposition.
Okay, so what's going on here is the idea that a certain kind of philosophical discourse or rationality can't decide one way or the other for the existence of God. And the reasons for belief in God that are given are often to do with passion. They're quite emotive. This is the point. It seems to me that it's obviously the case that philosophers and philosophy of religion, there is no definitive answer one way or the other, based on inductive or deductive reasoning. But human religiousness is highly complex, and it is to do with societal upbringing, it's to do with geographical location, it's to do with tradition, it's to do with background assumptions about the way the world is, fundamental commitments about the nature of reality. And of course, passion is an awful lot to do with it. But what I wouldn't want to concede that passion therefore has nothing to do with reason. Because I think that the two can certainly combine. It doesn't have to be that reason does all the work alone, or passion all the work, all of its own work. But I do think passion can be reasonable.
Okay, we're going to take two final questions at once, so that will provide either side to sort of summarise and combine the answers to that. So we will go to you in the middle, and then we will also go. Yes, back. Yeah. So if you just.
Hello, Hayden. I'm a bit of an imposter, I suppose. first I would dispute this. And I think that, in fact, we heard from, even Alex would concede that at that time the forms of art and the forms of science that were emerging did come out of theistic ideals and beliefs, and they were beliefs based on a kind of an exaltation of humanity, in addition to worship of God, and they were beliefs that carried conviction. Now, the forms of art and the forms of philosophy that predominate now, I would say, are not founded on conviction, nor, I think, on much respect or certainly much admiration for humankind, for humanity as a quality. As, for example, in...
Can you come to the question?
Yes. And so I would say that this provides empirical proof that abandoning the centrality of God in our thinking does not lead us to worship or to revere humanity, does not lead to convictions. It's one empirical point. When Shakespeare's characters mean business, they rhyme. None of our poems rhyme. We don't mean business. How do you explain that?
Question from the back. Do you want to come forward a little bit so we can hear the front?
Sarah, Trevelyan College. So, ever since the Enlightenment period, science and philosophy aim to replace God as a source of values and morality and the order of the universe. So do you think that as the scientific innovations or technology progress and as we're countered with this uncertainty and fear, we no longer find comfort in the scientific explanations, but instead we're going to look for God and this idea of like a deity or something that will remind us of the goodness of the humanity, and just that will give us hope that we can counter the societal changes and that we can preserve our values as a society.
Let's go to the proposition first.
Yes, so I think up to a point you're right. There's certainly obviously a kind of progression there from the Enlightenment, and this is in a way what I was trying to say, replacing of God as the highest ideal with man as the highest ideal. For myself, and I don't know to what extent I can speak for Nietzsche, but certainly as many people understand, the idea would be that is not to get rid of God. That's just to instantiate another God. The problem is though that we've heard a lot this evening about people wanting to defend humanity against the religious, etc. But I don't think that's really the issue. I don't think anybody is against humans. The problem is humanism. Humanism as an ideology and as a replacement for theology, because it leaves the very structure of nihilism untouched. And so we still don't see what is possible on this earth. That's the problem.
Well, I wanted to also address I entirely agree with you that about the connection between the arts and religious belief, and that's why, despite maybe the implication that people might have, or people may have heard from what I said, I am pessimistic in many ways about the decline of religion in society. I do think it's a sad fact. I think I share that with Nietzsche. I think that's evidenced by the fact that, well, God is dead and so is our architecture, right? We end up throwing off religion and ending up with the gherkin and the walkie-talkie and the barbican, which is something of an architectural manifestation of nihilism, if you ask me. I read a Twitter thread recently trying to defend brutalism as a manifestation of hope. That somehow, I know it's funny, laugh as you will, but it's not an account with a small following. saying...
The 10th of man, your main ornament being crazy eminent sculptures.
Right. Why not? I think this is a direct result of the lack of aspiration towards beauty in our society, and that may well have something to do with the death of God. However, I will ask you if it's a worthwhile trade, because we've also heard about morality from the second question here, and from at least one member of the opposition this evening, the dangers of subjective moral reasoning and the danger of essentially inventing ethics for ourselves. I want to ask you whether you think this is made better or worse by the involvement of an unanswerable authority. If you don't believe in God, that is, for example, you can still accept my thesis. That is to say that, sure, yeah, if somebody wants to kill me, if I meet a man who wants to kill me, there's not much I can do to talk him out of it if he doesn't believe in God. There's no ultimate moral appeal that I can make to him. All I can really do is threaten him with moral sanction or threat of law or something of this sort. I completely agree. However, if a man wants to kill me, and he believes in God, and he wants to kill me because he thinks that God is telling him to, there is nothing that I can say to change his mind. Even that minimal reproach available to me disappears, because there's no law written by any person of any time that could possibly count one iota against the edicts of the divine author of the universe. We've heard about Stalinism, for example, or it's at least been alluded to. And I want to ask you, would it be made better or worse? Of course, this is bad, but would it be made better or worse if the individuals who were murdering other people for their ideological beliefs believed they were doing so on the authority of the creator of the universe? I submit that what you get, because God does not exist in my view, if it's can you POI and answer to a question? I don't know. Well, that's happened twice now, but I'm going to talk about this later. I think what you end up with is, since whether or not you believe it comes from God, all of these moral pronouncements and all of this ethics is essentially a human invention. What you get by trying to grasp this objectivity of ethics, by attributing it to as having authorship within a divine creator, is all of the subjectivity, all of the arbitrariness, all of the self-interest, societal and individual, of subjectivity, of subjective ethics, that is of atheism, that is of nihilism, with all of the certainty and unanswerability and dogma of religious belief. That is a dangerous cocktail. Drink it at your peril.
Do the opposition like to
respond? Can I just first of all say, Mr. President, how much I've enjoyed this debate. So it's really good standing debate. It's been fascinating and really good evening. Thank you. Let's start with the gentleman over here. I agree with you. So poetry doesn't even rhyme. Don't even think of... What I made up a poem which rhymed. I've forgotten what it was. Don't vote for God is God, vote for the opposition instead. I mean, just to really try and get some rhyming back in. Yes, it's true that our culture is impoverished as a result of a decline in the belief of God, as the proposer himself has suggested. The fact that most people don't see the world as enchanted, don't see the world of speaking of a reality beyond itself. Don't see it as the heavens, as the scriptures say, the heavens declare the glory of God. Don't see reality as dripping with the presence of God. It's impoverishing. Yes, I think it is impoverishing. And I hope that might answer one of the points made over here. But I'd come back, I think, to an extremely good speech made from over here. Thank you very much indeed. And you summarised, I think, very, very clearly what this argument is about. There are only three reasons, as you so eloquently put it, which would be compelling for voting for this motion. The first is that the idea of God is dead, that people the world over are no longer believing in God. And that has been amply demonstrated is absolutely not the case. And it would be an act of extraordinary presumption and arrogance of us as Europeans to suggest that that's the case. The second is that God can be disproved philosophically or scientifically. And as was eloquently put, So, science cannot prove either way the existence or non-existence of God. Philosophy cannot prove the existence or non-existence of God. But philosophy and science can suggest and can demonstrate that it is reasonable to suggest that it is possible that God exists. And that's all you need to be able to say in order to vote against this motion. We might debate until the cows come home what Nietzsche meant by God is dead. We've had some insight into that this evening. But what does this statement, which Nietzsche came out with, which we're debating this evening, what can it mean now? It cannot mean any of those first two things, and we've begun to touch upon the way in which it is just not true to say that the majority of humanity cannot live without God as a transcendent being in order to inform their morality, their vision, their understanding of life, give them a purpose, give them a telos. And I would very much agree with my colleague that to abandon any transcendent reality for ethics is a very dangerous move to make. Of course there is bad religion. Of course all sorts of people, religious people, have committed atrocious acts in the name of God. But criticise them rather than the idea, the existence of God. If you want to propose the motion, I repeat, you need to be clear that you are an atheist. To do otherwise, if you are in the least bit in doubt, then you need to vote for the opposition.